We're going to look at some of the history involved in coming up with evolution theory as we know it today. And then we're also going to look at some of the basic principles of evolution before we start to look at them in more detail in later chapters. So as we begin our look at evolution, the first thing I'd like to have you think about is, what is evolution, or what do you think about when you hear the word evolution? Evolution, as we think of it as scientists, is basically changes that occur over time. So when you look at this definition as just changes that occur over time, this could include a lot of different things, but we're looking specifically at changes that occur within a population or a species. So these are going to be heritable changes. So we're going to be thinking about the DNA and the genes that are involved. And these are things that could be passed from a parent onto their offspring, because it is going to be something that is contained within the DNA that's being passed on to the offspring. Does evolution still occur today, or is this something that happened only in the past and no longer takes place? There's actually lots of examples of evolution that is occurring today. And just to get you thinking what some of the common everyday examples are, is think about antibiotic resistance. So antibiotic resistance is something that you hear about quite a lot with regard to physicians prescribing different drugs for individuals. Basically, do they need them or not, or would they be better to withhold those antibiotics and let someone get over a disease or an infection on their own? Basically, different bacteria develop resistance or evolve resistance to the antibiotics that we have. So this happens over time. So an antibiotic may be very effective starting off, and then maybe 5 years later, the effectiveness of that antibiotic is not much, and there are many bacteria that are not affected at all by the use of that antibiotic. Another example would be insect resistance to pesticides. So we have pesticide resistance. So same idea here. There are pesticides, and maybe initially when they're introduced to the public to use, or to commercial growers to use, they're very effective in controlling insects in crops. But over time, more and more insects are not affected by these insecticides. And you can think of herbicides, so weed killers the same way. Roundup is a very common one. Roundup does not kill as many weeds as it used to kill. It's a very widespread, widely used herbicide. So there's a lot of research that goes into developing new antibiotics all the time, new pesticides, new herbicides, because they do lose their effectiveness over time. This is due to the process of evolution. So this tells us that evolution is a continuous process. This is something that is taking place all around us every day. It's not just something that happened thousands or millions of years ago. So as we start to think about evolution as it is today, we want to think about some of the history involved in coming up with the theory that we now kind of hold true and hold to be the case. And this is going to be something that we study throughout the semester. As you can see, there were some early thinkers that certainly influenced some of the scientists that are on this timeline. If we start to look at these scientists here, which are a little more contemporary with Charles Darwin himself, Hutton is one of the first that we want to look at. And Hutton is known for his proposals of what we call gradualism. Hutton really was looking at geology. He was looking at the landscape, and he was studying how changes occur over time. So he is known as the founder of modern geology. So he is a geologist, or he was a geologist, and he studied and looked at volcanoes and erosion, rivers, mountains, how those things might be formed over time. And in this picture, we have a look at the Grand Canyon, and we have a little river going through the Grand Canyon there, or a big river going through the Grand Canyon. And what Hutton noticed was that these changes likely occurred over time. So if you think about erosion and how erosion takes place, If you have a river running through a little area, perhaps at first it's just a small little canyon or, track that it makes. And then over time, it's going to be a bigger rut that it makes. And then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We're not talking about something that's going to take place over the process of 10 years or 20 years or 100 years for that matter. We're talking about changes that slowly occur over millions of years. So very slow changes. And so he called this gradualism. He was the first person to really promote the idea that there can be changes that occur over time. But in his case, he wasn't talking about changes occurring to living organisms. He was talking about changes that occur to our planet or to our world around us. Yet another thinker that influenced Charles Darwin was Charles Lyell. So Lyell, he was very familiar with the ideas of Charles Hutton. So he was very familiar with Hutton's ideas that the environment, the world around us, the landscape, it does change over time and it changes very gradually. So he said, yes, these changes, they do occur. He looked at the mountains and he looked at the rivers and volcanoes, and he came up with what he called uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism basically said that there are processes that occur over time, and they do shape what goes on around us. The uniform part of the name here is he said these are processes that are always taking place. So they're always occurring. And besides this, they're going to be uniform or continuous in their occurrence. So you don't have a lot of change and then a period of no change and then a lot of change again. He said, no, these are uniform. They're occurring all the time. And these individual processes, they do shape the world around us. He was looking at geology just like Hutton was looking at geology. He published this book called Principles of Geology, which was a very prominent book of the time, and it was read and looked at by a lot of different scientists. So a lot of the evolutionary theory that we have today, a lot of those ideas were sparked by the ideas of Lyell, the ideas of Hutton, the idea that you can have changes over time, whether we're talking about the environment and things occurring to non-living things such as mountains and rivers. Okay, so as we look at this timeline, Charles Darwin, he's down here in the timeline, but he did have different scientific concepts that were published that he could read and study, and then later he did base a lot of his evolution theory on these concepts.